In 1969, the Windmill at Lacey Green in Buckinghamshire looked to most people like nothing more than a heap of firewood, suitable at best for hens and pigeons. The oldest smock mill in Britain, dating back to the middle of the 17th century, was in such a state that even the experts declared it beyond repair. At best, archaeologists thought its wooden machinery might be worth removing to a museum, if room could be found for it. Fortunately, a handful of men and women with vision and imagination were moved that the windmill, a once magnificent structure that had ground corn for nearly 300 years, had all been constructed by hand with simple tools. Only since grinding corn ceased in the 1920s had it fallen into such grotesque decay. One man, Christopher Wallace, a civil engineer, had both the imagination and determination to see that it could be restored. Placing their faith in him, in 1971 a local conservation group, the Chiltern Society, reached agreement with the windmill's owners and leased it for 25 years. One misty October morning, with the generous free loan of a mobile crane, and there was to be a great deal of such help in kind, work started by lifting off the roof to give access to the rest of the cap. Many friends and curious onlookers turned up, motivated mainly by a quixotic regard for what was about to be attempted, and to wonder that anyone should be so misguided as to try. The cap of a smock mill is the section standing on the top of the tower that revolves so that the sails can be kept into the wind, no matter from what direction it is blowing. With its contents, the massive brake wheel and wind shaft, it weighs some 4.5 tons. Only with this out of the way could work be started on the tower proper, the weakened strength of which could only be guessed at after the ravages of time and weather, neglect and vandalism had all taken their toll. It was a delicate and nail-biting operation. Chris Wallace later admitted to shaking with fright as the great weight of the brake wheel and wind shaft was lowered safely to the ground, the remains of the striking gear spider dangling appendix-like from the shaft itself. One indication of the great age of the windmill is the construction of this brake wheel and its companion wheel, the wallower, inside the tower. It's known as compass arm construction, which, for the technically minded, means that the spokes are mortised through the faceted wooden shaft, unlike the later clasp arm which superseded it. A cradle had been prepared to receive this precious load, and many of the windmill volunteers, both craftsmen and clerical alike, were on hand and ready to guide their heavy burden into the safe arms of the haven where it was to spend the next 6.5 years. Here, roofed and in the dry, refurbishment work could be undertaken in moderate comfort. The shed around it became the restorer's workshop. With the top off, inspection revealed that the building was in a strong enough condition for work to proceed to the next phase, the straightening of the tower. 5 months passed, and it was not until February 1972 that the next moment of truth arrived. One of the most alarming aspects of the windmill's dereliction was that the whole of the tower had slumped with a twist. This was because the cant posts, the supporting pillars at each of the 8 corners, were rotten and had given way under the weight of the cap and its heavy timber machinery above. Before they could be repaired or replaced, it was essential that the tower should be returned to a perpendicular stance. Chris Wallace's plan for this was as daring as it was ingenious. Literally to pull the framework upright by passing a thick steel cable right round the tower. In this operation, some cant posts had to be moved more than others. His solution was to anchor the wire rope securely to the posts that needed moving, but allow it to slip through heavily greased notches in those posts that did not. The Turper rope winch exerted a force of 5 tons. It took 2 pulls, one to untwist the tower, the second to pull it absolutely vertical. This took a total of 5 hours, but here we're able to see it speeded up into the space of a few seconds. With the tower upright, scaffolding, which had been promised free, on what was known at the time would be a very long loan, was erected inside the mill to hold it rigid, and outside so that work could proceed to the next stage. This was to strengthen and weatherproof the sides. The 8 posts at the 135-degree angle corners of the main tower stand on a brickwork base, and repairs to that were the logical next step. Not all the way round initially, but just for the first of the 8 sides. So the work proceeded in stages, each one completed, proving the ability of the team and providing firm evidence as a basis for appeals for financial aid. Bucks County Council had already made a generous contribution, and in February 1973 the Department of the Environment made a grant of £1,720 towards the then estimated cost of £3,000 or £4,000 in all. Of course, this estimate turned out to be only about half of the final cost, but it was still way below the £25,000 that a professional firm would have charged, even if one could have been found to do the job in the first place. Such was the confidence of all concerned in the safety of the structure, that as a way of further fundraising, and to increase awareness of the project generally, it was agreed in the summer of 1974 to admit the general public on Sunday afternoons to see the work in progress. This inevitably led to some conflict of interest between the Society's publicists and the mill workers themselves, who had sometimes to be content with working out of the visitors' way during opening hours. Visitors were shown how the main strengthening of the structural framework would be achieved. For this, a durable plywood membrane, protectively painted, was to be secured and concealed between 2 skins of weatherboarding, so that both the inner and outer surfaces of the tower would look authentic, but would actually return the repaired tower frame to its original strength. Labels helped visitors see what was being done. There were times when retention of the original woodwork was just not feasible, though the approach used in the whole of the restoration was to retain and repair as much as possible of the timbers of the original structure, rather than to renew them. As Chris Wallace so eloquently expressed it, it was our wish to retain the thumbprint of the men who had made the mill. It had all been made by men with simple tools who grunted and struggled to make wrought timber, and who had sweated and measured and made mistakes cutting the joints, but had finally succeeded in building their wooden monument nearly 300 years ago. Naturally, the Chiltern Society took the opportunity to attract new members. From now on, Sunday afternoon openings became a regular feature throughout the summer months. This took a support team of another 30 or so members, all dedicated to completion of the task their more active colleagues had so well in hand. Some of those early wardens are still at it today, 18 years later. Removal, refurbishment and replacement of the cant posts proceeded one at a time, in sequence. As each one was removed, it could be inspected and assessed to see how much of its timber could be saved, or would need to be replaced with new timber, scarf-jointed onto the old wood. As both cant posts of each side were restored firmly in place, the plywood skin could be screwed down and the double layers of weatherboarding applied. At times, when the whole of one side of the mill was taken off, a clear view of its 4 floors was revealed. Above the basement, the stone or milling floor, the bin floor where the grain was poured down chutes onto the stones below, and at the top, the dust floor, with the beautifully carved main shaft, topped by the impressive wooden-toothed wallower, which normally engages with the previously removed brake wheel and transfers the wind's energy from the sails down to the grinding stones below. Renewed timbers would be fitted onto old wherever the original could not be kept. Second-hand floorboards from Paddington Station onto the original joists. There were times when, in taking steel to wood, traditional tools were as effective or better than modern ones, or power tools. While each post was removed for treatment, the bricklaying had to keep pace with it, one corner ahead all the time. Each of the posts had to be secured to the brickwork base by a long iron holding bolt to prevent uplift when the wind blows hard. Each of these bolts had to be carefully replaced and firmly anchored into good brick courses. Strong tea kept the volunteers at their work, even when, as here in March 1975, their timetable and their ambitions required them to keep up the steady work on the cant posts, even though snow was falling. Neither cold nor rain could dampen their enthusiasm, and their stamina throughout these long years, almost every Sunday, week in, week out, was remarkable. Replacing the heavy cant posts into position was an arduous and labour-intensive operation, requiring a good turnout of volunteers on the days when this was scheduled. In time, all the sides were back on the mill, and some attention could be given to the machinery inside. Essential to any mill are its grinding stones, the cutting edges of which must be sharpened or dressed, exactly so if they are to do their job efficiently. The lower bedstone must have an accurately planed surface, so that when the minutely conical upper running stone lies face to face with it, a grain of wheat can enter at the centre and emerge as flour at the outside. The cutting edges all meet, like the blades of many pairs of scissors. These cutting edges, set out in harp-shaped grooves, are marked out in red ochre or ruddle, and then carefully chipped away until the stone dresser is satisfied that each of the stones is true and ready for setting up on the stone floor. This mill has 4 stones in all: a pair of Derbyshire millstone grit for grist or animal feed, and a pair of French burr stones for milling flour for bread. By mid-1976, all the posts and strengthening cladding of plywood were in place, and work could begin on repairs to the machinery at the top of the tower, the mechanism on which the cap and sails are kept turned into the wind. This toothed iron